Hello everyone and welcome to this HEC Paris virtual conference room for our HEC Insights webinar series. When joining the conference, you will notice that your microphones have been switched off. You will, however, be able to ask questions and make comments using the Q&A menu that you will find at the bottom of your window in your Zoom toolbar. The professor will only answer questions and read comments sent through this Q&A menu and will not be taking any questions coming from the chat. Please be aware that the questions in the Q&A menu can be upvoted by clicking on the thumbs up icon and thus prioritized on the professor's dashboard. Make sure that you keep the chat for technical questions to our team only. We would like also to remind you that the webinar is broadcasted live on YouTube. We'll now begin, and I'll leave the floor to Anne Michaud, Associate Dean for Faculty, Education Track and Pedagogy at HEC, to introduce our guest of today. Anne?
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome and thank you very much for being with us today. I am Anne Michaud, Associate Dean for Pedagogy at HEC Paris, and it is my greatest pleasure to welcome my colleague Afshin Mehrpouya, Associate Professor of Accounting and Management Control Systems, to talk about who would pay a bribe, a daring title, insights on ethical dilemmas in business and better ways to deal with them. Afshin is an academic expert on the role of performance measurement in governance of the environmental and social impact of firms. Afshin, thank you very much for accepting the invitation to speak in this webinar, and a very warm welcome to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Anne. This presentation is based on my past years of teaching ethics, being involved in the broader, in executive programs and MBA programs, being part of the broader dialogues about regulation of business, but individual, also the modes of individual human behavior. So I bring to this presentation some of the data that I've collected over the past 8 years at HEC, but also sometimes at other programs. And so how we go about this, we'll start with a little dilemma. I use this dilemma at the start of we use this dilemma at the start of our ethics course, which is a mandatory course for students who arrive at HEC. So I want you to quickly read this dilemma. I will read it with you. Would you pay $500,000 of consulting fees to a government official to get a $5 million contract for your company? It leads to a significant bonus for you. And you are fully convinced that there will be no trace of the payment and no legal risk. So you feel very safe about this transaction. And now please make your choice, whether you will pay to get the contract, whether you will not pay to get the contract, whether it depends on the jurisdictional, cultural, and national settings, or it depends on other contextual factors. So take a few seconds to respond with this that we will use as one of the bases for the rest of our discussion.
Afshin, we have 78% of the vote, so I'll leave a couple more seconds and we'll be able to publish the results.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll end the poll now and publish the result.
Yes. So 56% says they would not pay a bribe, pay the bribe. They don't, it doesn't depend on the conditions. They will never pay consulting fees, which is one of the nice ways to talk about a bribe. 28% they say it depends on the country, meaning that maybe in certain settings where they consider bribe to be more common, they would pay. 16% They would say it depends on other contextual factors, such as maybe the type of, let's say, transaction involved and the sector maybe, or I don't know what other factors they have in mind, but they don't rule out paying the bribe. Essentially, the answer that we have here tells us something very important, that 28 plus 16%, 44% of our audience, I don't know who they are, this is fully anonymous, but they have some inclination to want to pay a fee to get a contract, which is bribery. Thanks for your honesty. And by the way, this might not happen in practice. Maybe the people who say they will not pay, in practice they will pay in certain settings. Or maybe the people who say they will pay, they end up not paying in certain company cultures and situations. Regardless, this is interesting and a little bit, maybe we can call it, if we consider a society where people don't pay bribes as a better society, this can be a little bit troubling too. So, but the story doesn't end here. So among our student community, but also different student communities, when we run such tests, we get similar results. So on average, when our students arrive at HEC, at our MBA program, and I faced all of our students because it's a core training at HEC ethics, we have sometimes 50%, sometimes 40%. Minimum that we've had is 38% prepared to pay a bribe within certain conditions. And the rest of them, it depends. When we expand the independence conditions and make it safer, create more urgency around the transaction, for example, urgency around the need for the bonus to resolve a family issue, things like that, then the percentage can even increase beyond that to sometimes around 60%. So professional background effects, these people, all of them come from a corporate background, and depending on the sector, depending on the geographies where they work, I see patterns. I wouldn't talk about that because it's a bit speculative, but there are emerging patterns. One typical thing is, as you saw, depends on the country. A lot of times European students, for example, French students say that I would pay a bribe in other countries, assuming that a good chunk of the poor countries or third world countries, they're inherently corrupt. So it's fine to pay bribe in those settings, but not in necessarily in Western setting. This is what we call cultural relativism, which is essentially considering projecting certain attributes over certain settings, which legitimize certain problematic behavior. What's interesting is that among our students, when we ask who has already paid a bribe, well, we don't talk about bribe in a personal setting, such as a policeman harassing you. We're talking about, for example, in certain settings, we talk about business-related issues. We have somewhere between, it depends on the classroom, sometimes no one, sometimes somewhere between 2 to 5% of the students who actually raise their hands and they talk about the experience of having paid a bribe. But we can of course, appreciate that these numbers would be heavily biased simply because this is very difficult discussions to have and not all the students feel prepared to do that. But also something important to say is that we create very safe class environments so that people can speak up. Okay? The people can defend why they would pay bribe, and some other people will defend why bribes should not be paid. And we try to create debates around these different views among the students. So creating that safest space is very important to what we do to get these views out and to have them challenged. Because people who pay the bribe, they think everybody pays a bribe. And people who don't want to pay the bribe, they get surprised how many of their classmates are prepared to do so. So it's a fascinating discovery of what we consider to be taken for granted. Actually, it varies among people, and we can have a sane and important debate around it. And then we run also environmental damage dilemmas. We run social and workforce abuse dilemmas. What's interesting for environment, the percentage decreases a little bit. So we go down to something like 35 to 40%, that if there is no regulatory risk, then I would run that plan, for example, that would cause that some environmental damage, and then they just justify it saying that this is how the sector works. If I don't do it, the competition does it. I have to first consider the interests of my company, arguments like that. And for social and workforce, we have similar percentage, maybe slightly lower than environmental, depending on the type of dilemma, because not all dilemmas and situations resonate with all people in the same way. So it's an very interesting point to start an MBA program. And we also do this in executive programs sometimes and others to expose these differences among our students. And sometimes it's troubling too. Another test that we do with our students, we don't tell them the name of the test. It's called Machiavellianism test, but that name really, well, it might be too dramatic and emotional. The test is called Mac4. Essentially, it measures instrumental thinking, how much the end justifies the means. And it also has questions related to individual assumptions about inherent honesty and integrity and dignity of humans. Are humans inherently reliable and trustable? Or should the basis for relation to other humans be doubt and suspicion and protection of self? So there are 20 questions related to these issues. At the societal level, this is from a very large sample, 75,000, from a website called openpsychometrics.org. What they show is that among different age groups from the age of 13 to the age of 70, we have about the score can be anywhere from 20 to 140. So average scores vary anywhere from about 60 at the higher ages to about 72 at very low ages. At the age of 30, it should average around 68, and the global average of this is around 68. When we run this test among MBA student community at various programs, including HEC at the start of the program, we see averages that are about anywhere between 5 to 10% above societal tendencies. So this is one class, I don't want to tell you which class, 76.4, and these are from different years, and I can show you many more such graphs, 70, 73.6, 73.3. So always a meaningful increase compared to societal average for their age group and societal average in general. Again, more end justifies means and less trust in inherent humans' dignity and virtue. So what's happening here is that broadly when students argue about why, we see that me and self-interest, and sometimes for certain students from certain cultures, my company and my responsibility to serve my company against competition takes center stage, and then family. And then you have country and the broader humanity, the earth, broader public good, taking a little bit of a backseat for some, for a chunk of the students who argue for these positions. At the bottom is we see different value sets, whether it's religious, traditional, whether it's legality, whether it's professional norms, whether it's international norms, whether it's secular, humanist values. All of them take a backseat. Even materialist individualism, the Milton Friedmanian focus on greed, even that takes a backseat because it involves some reflection. A lot of times it can be simpler. It's just, I'm here to protect myself. I'm here to protect my company. There is, at the start of these engagements with some of the students, we don't go much beyond that. So now, why is this happening? Why do we observe such sometimes troubling readiness to engage in problematic governance, corruption, environmental, and social behavior? Well, something that we can say, maybe these students come from professional settings, and they give examples from their professional settings. So we can say some of it maybe is because certain corporate cultures are permissive and they don't question such behavior. There's not sufficient reflection about such behavior. So this is one thing that we can speculate from what the students tell us about their past experience. Another one is selection bias at business schools. Well, we know that MBA students are all of them about trying to have a major shift in their career, increase their salaries. So it's a phase in their careers, maybe that they think much more instrumentally. So at business schools, we have an accumulation of more instrumental thinking compared to the broader societal setting. And then in management education, also we can say that in different courses, there is an overt emphasis on profitability and result rather than the ethical boundaries of behavior. For example, the ethical boundaries, what is ethical marketing? What are the problematics in accounting in terms of accounting fraud, in HR, in the strategy, in finance? Is it that we focus more on implications for corporate bottom line and less on the ethical boundaries around such behavior? And then, of course, we will all think that, well, this is just in a classroom setting or in a Zoom setting, people just clicking from home. Maybe this doesn't matter. Well, we can say, of course, it depends whether in practice we will do this stuff that we say in such tests. The context will affect us, the specifics of the situation will affect us. Nonetheless, when we answer such a question in a safe setting, it's an indication that will guide a little bit and our action. It has some effect, it's not nothing. So we shouldn't overread in the surveys, but we should still acknowledge that they're meaningful and we can read something significant from them with caution. And then we see also similar critiques, but this is from a month ago, I think, about McKinsey's consulting teams involved in providing consulting in the OxyContin crisis in the US for opioid sales. And this is a former McKinsey partner, I think Tom Peters, who says, well, he puts the blame on business school education. Well, that's one reading of the situation. Regardless, every now and then somebody stands up and says, hey, we have an ethical crisis. People don't question at all the boundaries of what they do. They just focus on profitability, bottom line, which takes us to very problematic situations, such as this one. You should look at the details. It's pretty abhorrent and weird, the type of advice that was provided in this specific setting for this company. So what do we do about this? So it seems like if 40% of our workforce in certain settings, they're prepared to engage in problematic behavior, what does it do to our companies? And what does it do to society and environment? And how can we address this? The typical answer, unfortunately, it's not very effective and it doesn't work very well. So good governance, separation of, let's say, the ethics committee and the compliance committee and the audit committee and remuneration committee and whistleblower programs and having a code of ethics. Well, this is all very useful processes, but they have also significant limits, as we see on the right side. This is the code of ethics of Enron. A lot of times it stays on paper. It doesn't transform to a culture. And the implication is that it doesn't really protect the firm against this diversity of the way people make decisions, especially in our increasingly multicultural international workforce settings. And we can see that some of the most significant recent governance crises have actually happened in companies with very nice on-paper governance and compliance programs. So, and then we should also remember, I want to emphasize that ethics doesn't only show itself in the big moments, when you pay a bribe, when a company goes bankrupt because of a major case of, let's say, accounting fraud, whether it's Enron or WorldCom or other companies, or whether it's a major case of sexual harassment or case of abuse of power. No, actually, ethics is present every day, in every interaction, in every such meeting, in the way that people articulate their positions. Is the position articulated based on narrow focus on self-interest? Is the position articulated based on, let's say, various ways of serving power structures in the firm? Does it consider the voice of the employees? Does it consider the voice of the customers and other affected stakeholders? What are the processes involved in articulation of a view in a very mundane day-to-day meeting? So again, ethics is all the time, everywhere. We hear about it in the moments of crisis. It affects us all the time in a big way. So most corporate focus is on the visible flagrant breaches. However, micro breaches are inherent in all business interactions, meetings, etc. And we can always reflect on what is the ethical basis of what a manager says, does, and essentially how is that position taught out and articulated. And that's ethics at work all the time. And this cannot be captured by compliance, cannot be captured by various committees. So that's definitely not the solution to this significant day-to-day challenge. And it affects all companies' activities and risk every day. Another thing that I want to highlight before going to the second part of the discussion about what can we do about this is that there is a lot of hype these days. I'm also part of that hype because I teach also sustainability about sustainability. So sustainability is excitement. Sustainability is about turning social and environmental concerns into business model design, requiring innovation. It's about finding essentially new ways of doing business that are profitable while serving the world. That's all very nice, and that's all very important. It's exciting, it's effective in communications, it's very fashionable. Ethics is none of those things. It doesn't expand activities, it sets boundaries around activities. It's a bit darker. It talks about whistleblowing, it talks about fraud and lawsuit and harassment, but also more those micro practices of ethics also. And it's mostly because of these reasons invisible. So in business education, but also in corporate training, in corporate cultures, these days, there is a lot of the former sustainability, which is nice. If there is much less emphasis on the latter, which is ethics, which is, I think, it affects, by the way, these two also, they influence each other. Of course, when we talk about more about sustainability, it does affect ethical behavior also in subtle ways and the other way around. However, it's important to bring the second one out because in terms of affecting businesses, affecting their profitability and relations to the world, I think the latter plays a very central role, and it really affects the way we do business and the way our employees operate in our companies in fundamental ways. So why are some companies? Because we see patterns, of course. There is a lot of research showing different patterns in terms of involvement in lawsuits and fines and day-to-day ethical behavior of companies. We also see that in our students, depending on what sector they're placed in, what country they work in, what type of corporation they work in, the way they answer to our dilemmas and they engage their different debates, we see patterns emerging. One important factor that comes up all the time is the issue of distance. We don't realize the impact of our decision. We conveniently make our decisions far from the situations that our decisions impact the world. So decisions at a distance limit understanding of impact and the capacity to listen to those affected. So this is from a very famous experiment, the Milgram experiment, that showed that when people sit far from where the victim is, as part of a fake scientific experiment, they would be happy to use this machine to give shocks to that person in the other room, going all the way to 400 volts, which is essentially killing the person. And there is some, I think, parallels between this and a typical Excel file that converts people's situations, a whole restructuring programs into a set of numbers. We can do it from far away. And the implication of that is that we are not in the process very good at understanding the details, the impact, the side effects, and also we are definitely not in a position to listen to those who are affected. So some companies are, for example, running rotation programs, sending managers to different operational sites so that they get a sense of how work is done, get a sense of relations to various constituencies and stakeholders on the ground. And this leads to becoming better when they're behind an Excel file in imagining and understanding the effect of your work. And then accompanying numbers in Excel with imagery, with narratives, but also with visits to the sites. And again, to attain an understanding and a mode of listening rather than just relying on abstract information and numbers. And in the process, becoming a better listener. And I think that's essentially at the core of one of the core attributes of what a good manager, or what good direction, what good execution are. The next one is an obvious one. I couldn't exclude it, but I would go over it quickly. Of course, culture, and culture is so many things and nothing at the same time. It's very important. Again, Enron had fantastic paperwork around ethics, but a very, very ferociously corrupt and essentially hierarchical culture. So I would just emphasize the importance of role models in culture, that more than these ethical trainings, clicking, and not even looking at the questions in these ethical training programs, which are again important, but a lot of times they're just meaningless formalities. Employees look at how their managers, how their colleagues work, what is acceptable to them and what is not. So this is really one of the key engines of constructing a corporate culture, rather than relying primarily on communication, which is important, and various types of textual training, which is important, but does not really replace the important role of the relational aspects of ethics. And again, another thing that comes from my teaching the past 8 years, a key challenge is this cultural relativism, that we can do it there, but we would not do it at home. I will pollute, let's say, somewhere in Mexico for competitive purposes. I would not do that in my hometown. I hear that all the time from my students. So this shows the importance of going beyond compliance orientation. It's not enough to say we are compliant with all laws and regulation in all jurisdictions that we operate. That's actually exposes the company to this ad hocness of behavior of the populations that we saw in this presentation. And it shows the importance of having a powerful, potent culture setting the principles across operations. So I think cultural relativism is one of the core engines of corrupt and problematic behavior in businesses, based on our observations from our students. And finally, the importance of expanding the spaces for reflection. So companies that have less power hierarchy, that employees, for example, are not put in competition with each other so that they can have dialogues with each other. Employees are not alone in such settings. So this is one of the key attributes, I think, of work settings, when problematic behavior can be discussed rather than people having to decide in isolation. And that's a fundamental factor enabling people to be better equipped in this situation. For Milgram experiment, for example, we know that when the people who give the shocks, they have an opportunity to discuss before the test, the level of the number of people who would go all the way decreases compared to when they are facing the situation alone. Many companies who have performance measurement systems who put people in competition become essentially much more exposed to these risks, because people are much less good at making reflexive decisions when they're alone, facing power hierarchies and complex and difficult situations. Decreasing power distance is easy to say, but difficult to do. But the more hierarchical and a company is, and the more power distance in the hierarchy, the more the chances that hierarchy would push people to do things against their values that they would regret later on. And enabling, again, this is difficult, but this is central to the company that are more successful at this. Enabling is speaking truth to power. Whistleblowing is one of them, but a culture in which different voices not stifled, rather it's appreciated. It can be exposed in the meetings, in various types of employee consultations, so that the different voice is not marginalized. This is an important signal to all employees that can effective much more quality and safe debates. Again, I know the difficulty of implementing these. I'm just giving examples of, I've seen companies doing this more effectively than others. So it is possible. And what we do also, ethical training, I think is an important aspect of this. It can be done when we are managers, but also at business schools. Not unfortunately, this is much less common than sustainability training for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. And I think it's urgent that we expand the space for ethical training and ethical education because of all the implications that we just discussed. So what we do in ethical training is that we don't want to preach. We don't want to tell, like many of the ethical training of our HR departments do. They show us the right direction. You don't do this, you don't do that, this is not good. Our company's culture doesn't permit this or that. What's emphasized less is the decision-making process, how we get to those decisions, what debates and discussions are needed to get to good quality decisions, and how our employees move towards becoming more reflexive before they make decisions, how they learn to question the taken for granted things. Another thing that we do in our ethical training is that we create a safe space, because people are afraid of discussing this stuff. People are afraid of talking about what they've done and that it's troubled them. People assume as a result that all the others think about them, or they just think about it at all. They don't reflect on the others' views on these things. So creating safe spaces and enabling debates, talking about difficult issues among the students and managers. It's a really transformational issues in terms of becoming better decision makers, I think, through our professional trajectory. Question is taken for granted. So this contrasting of ideas leads to the students to question things that they thought everybody acts like that, everybody pays a bribe. So there are lots of assumptions. Each decision, for example, I say I pay a bribe, it depends on which country. Assume that certain countries are corrupt. I assume that corruption has no social implications anyway. I assume that if I don't pay a bribe, competition will do that anyway. I assume that when I pay bribe and it seems like there would be no legal risk, there is actually no legal risk. All of these are assumptions. We take them for granted. And in such situations, these assumptions get troubled, and the structures that enable our decision-making, then it becomes foregrounded and questioned. And finally, the capacity to listen by getting rid of those distances. And part of our training is, for example, we have a game, United Nations game that we use, that one student makes a difficult managerial decision, and the other students emulate different stakeholder groups, and they evaluate the decision made. These are exercises in becoming better listener, more empathic, putting ourselves in the shoes of all of those various actors, especially the voiceless, because some actors have a lot of voice, they're easy to hear. Investors are easy to hear, for example. Companies executive are easy to hear. Customers are relatively easy to hear. But becoming a good manager is developing an ear and skill set to get a broader sense of all of those voices that are not that easy to hear. So with that, I hope I'm not over time, and we can take a few minutes now to engage with questions.
Thank you very much, Afshin. Thank you for all this. We do have questions. Maybe the first one. So first of all, I engage you all to click on the Q&A menu to ask your questions. You have a first one, which is, what is the most logical definition of the word bribe? Quite interesting question. And this Atif says, in my country, government officials have termed the phrase speed money, which it take even for doing the legal work. And then is this bribe?
That's a great question. So there's a lot of, anytime that we do something problematic that we feel that we shouldn't be doing it or doing that, we need to make it easier by changing the language, changing the process. For example, we never give bribe money like this in the hand of the other person. Nobody is comfortable with that. No, money is put in a book, it's put in an envelope, it's done through various modes of transfer that hides the money. We don't use the word bribe. We use the word, for example, consulting fees, or whether in French, we have a very nice term for it, pot de vin, a little bit of wine, which on the side facilitates the situation. It's nice and friendly. And you go to any culture, you have different terms. In Iran, we have also 3-4 terms to talk about bribery, simply because we're not comfortable to talk about actual bribe. So I think what we learn in this course is avoiding decisions that we will regret later on. When we do these things, we feel uneasy about them. We don't tell our families about them. We don't tell our friends about them. We know that it's problematic behavior. We engage with ourselves to convince ourselves. Sometimes companies help us in this. Our managers say, hey, everybody here that does that, you should do that. Otherwise, we're out of business. Okay, that's some help. The language is provided sometimes by the company and by the culture, saying that this is not really bribe, it's a gift. But we feel that unease. But it's important to deepen that questioning and give some space to that unease, create the spaces to discuss it. And one last thing that I wanted to say is, so what is bribe and what is not? Yeah, I think we're not here to, yeah, what I tell my students, this is what I wanted to say. always use the most difficult language to talk about your action and see whether you would still do it. So that would mean if you want to give somebody consulting fee, say, would you be happy to say aloud that, not I didn't pay consulting fee, actually I paid a bribe. Would you still do that? If you're, for example, involved in a process of restructuring, which is a natural part of business activity, and in the process you're getting rid of some FTEs, which is a nice way to talk about one unit of workforce. If you say instead, in the process, we have to fire 400 employees, would you involve the same type of analysis, or the frankness of the language engages you in more reflection, more rigorous process and discussions about what you're doing? So essentially, I think getting rid of the easy and distant language is part of the exercise. I didn't answer really your question, but I said some things that I think matter to me.
Interesting. Maybe a short question before we go to longer ones, Afshin. Yeah. One would be, okay, in business schools today, we are teaching increasingly ethics, business ethics in general. Do you think, what do you think we should move towards, even more attention to ethics in business schools? How useful is what we do already? What's the impact? And how should we move further?
That's a great, I ask myself all the time, am I just doing this to feel good about it, or does it really do something? My belief is that it doesn't happen through one course is a good start, but it doesn't go all the way. I think we need a culture where every course on every topic involves also discussions about the ethical boundaries of that topic. Not any marketing is acceptable. When engaging, for example, in financial analysis, also having sessions on problematic behavior. So I think this type of reflection should be an inherent part of education in all of these different courses. I think what's also important is that the schools, but also companies, should have spaces for specific discussions on difficult decisions and on ethics. So we should have seminars, we should have working groups, we should have various engagement that also involve with the darker side, the problematic side, because the nicer side, it has its engine. Sustainability, for example, it's easy. Everybody is excited. There are lots of speakers coming in. How many speakers do we have coming in, for example, to our school, talking about the more difficult, problematic, the ethical challenges that we have at work? So we have more work to do for integration of this into our schools culture. I think we're still advanced compared to many others because we have it as a core course and we've been expanding its space. But I think in terms of its integration into all our courses and becoming an inherent part of our student life and the student education, I think we have work to do. And again, in the broader business school community and world, there's I think this is a very urgent issue to think about and engage with. What effect has it had? I see concrete cases of some students coming to me and saying that I would never believe that so many of our classmates would do this type of stuff, or they would say it, or that so many of my classmates would find my mode of working problematic. I thought this is fine. So I think exposing these issues, students say that actually most of the training doesn't happen in class. The debates continue after the class. And so this is already an effect for me. This is not nothing. But going against the big waves of focus on profitability, the career pressures they're under and things like that, I always ask myself the question of 5 years down the road, a lonely course, even though it's a core course, does it have any implication? I don't know. I hope so. It needs some empirical research to follow up with the students and to see what's happening with them. And I don't know, it's a difficult exercise to do. I stay optimist and I do what I can.
Right. Thank you very much for the answer. I think there are a couple of questions that are on the same topic related to just what we talked about right now. A lot of people, so Jérôme, Christian, Christophe, are asking, yeah, but sometimes you are in a position where you have to operate in countries where bribing is quite usual. And then how do you react then? Because or you don't do business, or how can you do it when other players play non-fairly, let's say? So when you compete with company based on in non-really countries that don't have the same ethics, which can bribe, how do you react? How do you react? How can you win contracts in countries where bribes are inherently part of the business culture, but you can't do it yourself? And all the questions related to that.
So I'm not here to say whether paying bribe is right or not, or give advice on this. I'm here to say that we have a diversity of students, and some of them are happy to do this and some of them are not. And these are important debates to have. This is step one. Now I can give you some of the answers because I get my students to debate each other about. And some say it's not possible. I was working in a country in Western Africa, and bribery was so common that if you don't pay a bribe, you're out of business. The answers that they get, or let's say some say very crudely that in China, bribery is part of the business. So then I say, well, one thing that we question in class is it the case that China is, for example, is a very corrupt country in big business transactions? How do you know that? What percentage of transactions over there you think they're corrupt? And they say 80%, 90%. And then I say, where do you get that? And we question this, and we get to an interesting observation that people who pay bribes, they need to feel comfortable about it. To feel comfortable about it, they exaggerate about the pervasiveness of bribery. And in the process, these numbers get exaggerated a lot of times simply because there is an engine of exaggeration, because all the people who pay bribe, they need to feel comfortable about paying bribe. So we should not always have views about the pervasiveness of bribery. Of course, in certain settings, bribery is common, but how we perceive it is always exaggerated a little bit compared to actual practices. Students who don't want to pay a bribe, how they would answer you is, well, number one, if it's a job that forces me to pay a bribe, though some students say, I will change my job. But this is not the way I want to live. I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to feed my family. I don't want to be part of a country's demise into more and more corrupt culture. So this is a wrong place for me. I would move on. Some others will say, I'll try to be innovative about it. And they give examples of it. They say the same way we can be innovative about sustainable business models and triple bottom line, we can be also innovative about staying ethical while also sustaining business. So some of them, for example, they've created a community of companies in a country that pressure the government around setting a set of anti-corruption standards. It's not also possible in all countries. It depends on the national. Sometimes it's impossible. I agree with you. But some of the managers that I've talked to, they've been smart in innovating to work with some other companies that are like-minded to try to create a space for themselves that's a little bit cleaner. Again, I don't have a good answer, but what I want to say is that it's a very important debate to have already, that in most of the companies that I talk to, these issues are taboos and people are alone in making these tough decisions.
Yeah. Thank you. Maybe again, related to this, so this is a pretty central issue in many sectors, many countries, many companies. Why don't we hear more about it in business schools? And today, to be honest, we have business ethics courses and you teach many of them. So that's great, but should it be like more central in public debate, in business schools, in business publications as well? We do have journals in business ethics, but they are not like, you know, mainstream in all business journals, basically all academic journals. So what about this?
Well, as I said before, I think ethics has a more difficult engine behind it. So sustainability has an easy market engine. It's good for image. We have to talk about it because of all the pressures, visible pressures we are under, and it links to profitability increasingly in significant ways in most sectors. So there's a strong economic and communications engine behind it. And that's why it does its job. Ethics doesn't have such an engine. So far, the linkage to, it's been mostly in businesses, a taboo topic. We've left it to compliance programs, mostly, and governance programs. And as I said, the biggest cost of ethics is not in big action. It's small day-to-day actions that the companies and economies and societies pay the price of ethics. So I think there hasn't been the same market engines. It's not sexy like sustainability or various innovation or even transparency is. It lacks because it's a darker topic. And the implication is that I think we pay the price collectively while the issue is not being at all addressed and debated at the level that it should be. I observe so many business schools, and it's whatever they want to be nicer and greener and respond to societal pressure. It's all about going green, impact investing, and CSR and those things, responsible investments. But I've rarely seen a business school featuring in its image the focus on ethical decision making and producing responsible, ethically reflexive managers. So I think there's been challenge in converting focus on ethics to a market force. And as a result, it's been left on the side.
Yes, right. And there is so another question which is totally related to this. So Yukiko, who asks, what is the best approach to educate your employees to keep themselves away from bribing, especially in environments where this is pretty much the rule? Would it be with a video tutorial? What role do they play? When do you think would be the best time to do this in a company? And then also asking what would be the best logic to talk about this, given that most of the time employees are very desperate about making money. They look at sales, about performance. And so this topic is maybe not something they would love to focus on. So how do we best manage that?
So it's a very big question. You could have a long, seminar on this, or this is the core of lots of consulting engagement for many organizations. So we can't address it in the space of one question. All that I will say is that ethical training doesn't happen in ethical training. Ethical training happens in day-to-day culture of the company. If your company has high power distance and strong authority over managers, if your company is a company that has been involved in some major corporate scandals recently that makes the people think that if that's the way our executive operate, of course we can do the same thing. If your company is a company that doesn't have listening to stakeholders as part of its culture, whether it's for small management decisions for starting a new retail store for a company, or whether it's major decisions at the regional or national level, if it doesn't have, because listening makes us more ethical in general. If we listen, we project our ideas on the others, which leads to making very sided decisions. If we don't create safe spaces for employees to talk to each other, again, I agree with you that budgetary and performance management pressures are a significant part of this. Companies' level of exposures to fines, issues, lawsuits increases significantly when they become more ambitious financially and they put more budgetary pressures and financial pressures and performance pressures on their business unit managers and employees as a result. So if we take this path in the process, we should know that we're moving our company into uncharted territories and spaces of problematic behavior. And in every meeting, in the way we articulate our views, it'll be more and more self-focused and short-term focus, but also in major breaches that I mentioned before. So I think when we move towards becoming a company that's more aggressive financially, we should equip ourselves more also ethically by paying attention so that employees who sit side by side, they don't compete with each other. That's so important. So many of my students, they say that I was so lonely at work because I was competing against my two colleagues sitting around me. I would not dare speak up because I would be fired after a 1-year short-term contract and they would stay on. So I think companies, engage in something that's really the remedy for disaster when they have performance measurement systems that push for competition even among people within the same business unit. So my answer is no. Those video tutorials, I've done them as an employee before. It's a nice little formality. It doesn't do much. And formal training, depending on how they are done, but a lot of training that I've seen in my past corporate life, it's just clicking through some documents. It was totally meaningless. So it depends on the quality of the engagement and whether it creates a safe space for debating. I can go on repeating that many, many times. Safe spaces for debating, bringing out our views and being challenged. That's the core of how we become better at these decisions. And I will stop there.
Right, right. Video tutorials can be useful to raise awareness at least, and maybe to show what the situation is, because at first you were saying some students are surprised to see how others can react. So maybe information-wise, they can be useful.
Yeah, we shouldn't over-rely because it's too easy an answer. We put a tutorial out and an annual training with 40 elements in it, and then we've solved this problem. What I'm saying is that moving from that to a culture, it's a big leap, and it's an important leap. And we shouldn't overestimate the potential of such devices. They're useful. They have their place in the broader apparatus that enables a company to become much better at dealing with problematic situations. On its own, I think it does very little. We should do it, but it's not enough.
Right. Okay. So Afshin, thank you very, very much for all this. I think we've covered most of the questions and different topics that were asked. Maybe one last one from Adrien, who says, assuming you are an international company with offices all around the world and operate rotation with the management, it must be quite hard to educate the manager who pass from so whatever, one country to the other, where cultures could be very different. Do you need to re-educate your managers by country? Or is it just, how do you do that? Yeah, indeed, in global companies, managers might be, sort of facing very different situations. So how do you do the onboarding? Driving awareness-wise.
Yeah. So I think there is because of the diversity of jurisdictions and diversity of sectors and companies, I don't think there is one single big easy answer. What I would say is that, yeah, there is mobility, cultures are different, and getting to know the political actors in each setting, I think it's difficult. It takes time. Getting to know the stakeholders, the cultural setting, it takes time. What I would, I think, emphasize is that it's important for a manager to value knowing of the political setting, listening to the stakeholders as part of their decision-making. Good decision makers are decision makers who listen. Otherwise, we make fantastic decisions that make us profitable for 3 months or 6 months or 1 year. But as a company, I think, in the longer scheme of things, will be affected by the pushback from the same stakeholders. So I think it's important to rethink how we make decisions and how we acculturate ourselves into a setting, spending time with all intra-firm, but also external actors for new managers. It's important. Engaging in processes of stakeholder engagement and consultation that makes us listen to those actors. It's important. Creating spaces so that our employees can openly talk to us so that we get a sense of what's going on. It's important because most of the companies, to be very frank, inside the companies, voices very stifled. People are too afraid of being fired, too afraid of their managers, and too focused on profitability and too alone vis-a-vis situations. So I think that's another thing as a manager, stepping into a new country should emphasize on. So this could be a template, a 5-point way, thing that we should not forget to enable a management that's listening, effective, and adaptive in different national settings.
Okay. Thank you very much, Afshin, for your time and for this great presentation. I think now we did cover all the questions, most of them at least. Great, thank you. And so I hope it raised awareness to our audience, to the different reactions of people at least. And I hope they will find the ways to deal with these topics. Thank you very much, Afshin, again. And to all our audience, thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for your questions, the interaction, and see you for our next webinar 1 month from now. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.